So the next definition is borrowed light, and a borrowed light is basically what we would call in the hollow metal industry a window, even though it's really not a window, it's a borrowed light. It would be a window except that you'd see it in a wall versus a light or a window that you would see in a door. We don't really use the term window in the hollow metal industry, at least not that I really can refer to in terms of it being a proper definition. It's always a light or a light cutout or a borrowed light. And in fact, when I search the glossary for window, it's different than borrowed light in the sense that a window refers to something that's installed in an exterior wall, and a borrowed light would be something installed in an interior wall. And the term borrowed is like the classic definition of borrow. You are receiving something from one else. So a borrowed light is going to borrow the light coming in through a window or an alternative light source, a borrowed light. Borrowed lights are a lot of fun. Borrowed lights can be standalone windows. We've done them as small as, 2 foot by 2 foot. We've done them epically large, where I see these, and the one time that I did an epically large borrowed light was in a hospital setting. And if you go into a pediatric type of environment, you'll see these sorts of epic borrowed lights, where what we did one time was about a 20-foot, we didn't build this in our shop, a 20-foot radius borrowed light wall that was maybe about 60 degree of a circle, all curved, all lights. I don't recall the individual sizes, probably 2 foot by 5.5 feet, possibly a 2-inch sill, or mullion really, sill, and then a 2-foot light below it, and then a 4-inch sill. And it was really cool. This thing was super expensive, and it had to get shipped to the job site in multiple sections to be, not only multiple sections to fit into a truck, but to be able to fit in the building once they've received it. In terms of borrowed lights, things that we've done that are not square or rectangular are going to be a side light. So a side light, if you've got a 3.0 whatever size door, and then you've got a side light, which is basically a borrowed light that's attached to a door frame. Those can get very fun because you can do them in lots of sizes. Very wide, where the light is the full height, or maybe you'll have a stub wall about 4 foot tall, and above there is lights. You might do symmetrically balanced sort of borrowed lights. So lots of things can be done when you're dealing with borrowed lights in the sense of interior types of design. One interesting thing about borrowed lights is you would obviously use stick material. So your frame profile material is going to be made in whatever depth, typical 5 3/4, or any size really, in just long lengths. I think back in the old days, Kiwani made them 10'3" is what they were. So that was your standard stick length. So you would take a piece of, stick material, your blank jam material, and you would put it into your saw and you would cut it, and then you would notch at the stops on 2 of the 4 pieces, and then you would cut for the other 2 pieces. You'd square that all up and you would weld it and you'd be done. A neat trick about all of that is if you're dealing with even sizes like 3 foot by 4 foot, 2 foot by 2 foot 6, whatever, you can generally take 2 masonry headers and 2 drywall headers, and they will fit together, and all you have to do is face weld. The problem with that is you're going to have backbend returns on 2 of the 4 sides. Most people don't really notice it. Depending on who the client is, I would say, well, a borrowed light's going to take me 5 days to make, or I can, because of all the cutting involved, or I can take these headers and come back in the shop here and let me show you what I'm going to do. He's like, oh, that'll be fine. You can do it just like that. That'll be faster. So that's a tip or a trick that you can use, and we certainly didn't invent it, or at least I should say the person who showed it to me in my shop in 1991, he feels like he invented it, but I know other hollow metal shops are well aware of that trick. The problem, though, with that trick, though, is if you're dealing with masonry anchors, and you have backbend returns because you've used 2 drywall headers, your masonry anchors aren't going to fit in correctly. So, you know, that may or may not be the best idea to use the drywall and masonry header trick. But when you're installing Browd lights into a wall, it's generally a welded unit. So you're going to have something that's been completely welded. Well, that doesn't work when you have existing construction. So what will happen is you can do slip together Browd lights, where you basically have a Browd light section that'll look like this. It's half of the Browd light where they've cut it right down the center of the thickness. And you'll have this sort of scenario that comes together. You can slide these pieces together, and then your stop goes over the seam and you screw it down and you can't tell, because what you're dealing with is a hole in the wall, and that hole in the wall is masonry, and you are not just getting your Sawzall and just easily cutting that out. What's going to happen when you have existing openings, whether it be masonry or drywall, you're going to tell your shop, your manufacturer, your distributor, here is my rough opening size, and then they will undersize the exposed glass size, the overall size, to fit that amount of room that you need to slide that in. And these Browd lights are obviously based on not only your rough opening width, your rough opening height, but the wall thickness as well. So you'll be able to do Browd lights for existing and new construction, new holes in walls. You're going to also be able to, you know, different manufacturers will have different derivatives or variants on the slip together style for existing openings. You can, certainly there's light gauge manufacturers, light gauge frame manufacturers. Ready Frame is timely. These are names that come to mind. They're going to have snap-on casing options. Wood casing is a possibility as well. So you can do Browd lights in lots of instances. And the typical use for a Browd light, if you've ever had, you know, the regular chain company of oil change businesses change your oil, you pull in, well, you pull up to the back, they take your car, and when you're in the waiting room, you can look right out that Browd light and see all the work that's being done. Typical application for a Browd light. In terms of the glass, you can put any glass in there that you want, I mean, provided that it meets code for safety, for life safety. You know, if you've got a 90-minute wall, you're not going to be putting, you know, your grandfather's good old classic, you know, Misco or diamond wire glass in that anymore. That's all changed. Nor is it, well, depending on which variant of wire glass it is, it may not be a safety product. So as long, you can put any glass in there that you want, so long as it meets all of your code requirements and will actually fit. So if you had a really small wall, a thin wall thickness, even 4 3/4 in terms of a jam depth, a 3 3/4 wall, 2-inch metal studs, 5/8 rock, or whatever the stud size that's going to get you, a 2.5-inch wood stud with 5/8 rock on either side. The amount of room you have left over, I mean, you're going to have a 1 15/16 rabbet, but if you get really small, and depending on what your application is, where you want the glass installed, to the relationship of which rabbet you'll use if it's unequal, you've got to be mindful of how wide your glazing channel is, how thick your glass is, and do you have enough. If you had 3/4 wide glazing channel and 1-inch insulated glass, which you could on an interior application, you could, you're not going to have enough room in an unequal frame if you're putting it in the small side, or the smaller of the two rabbets, so you have to think that detail through. And Browd lights are generally just standard 2-inch face, but they can be anything. They can be whatever your manufacturer can make. 1.5 inch, 1 3/4. It can be larger as well. So all of that meets kind of the general definition of Browd light. It's basically a window in an interior application, and when the window is in an interior application, we don't call it a window, we call it a Browd light. So let's switch to the screen view and let's take a closer look at the definition and some other supporting ideas. If you are enjoying this video, please click thumbs up or like, and also please consider subscribing to our channel. Let's move on to the rest of the video. Okay, here's our definition of Browd light. A glazed opening frame installed in an interior partition prepared for field installation of stationary or fixed glazing, meaning it's not going to be a casement or a hopper. It's not going to be operable. It's just a sheet of glass that's not going to move or open or ventilate. Mullions may be used to divide individual glazed areas, similar to window. And we'll just look at window, because they're referring to it. Window, a glazed opening installed in an exterior wall prepared for field installation of stationary fixed glazing. Mullions may be used to divide individual glazed areas, similar to borrowed light. Yeah, so nowhere really in here are you dealing with anything that's going to operate. Now, having said that, we have used borrowed lights for, I guess it's not a borrowed light anymore. So imagine a cased opening stick material that you've welded it to be 3 foot tall and 5 foot wide, and then you're going to use the typical classic sliding glass track like you would have in the doctor's office. I'm going to pull up, at some point, I'm going to pull up what I'm trying to show you. So you've got a couple of pieces of 1/4 inch glass that bypass, and we've all seen this at the dentist's office or when you're checking in. And Knapp and Vogt may be the only people who actually make this. Yeah, it's a P992. Okay, I just don't remember my part numbers. Yeah, so ball bearing glass assembly. Obviously, what you're dealing with is, you know, you've got a couple of pieces of glass that slide against each other. You've got a steel frame. Is it a borrowed light? Yep, you're borrowing light from another source, there's no doubt. But it also has the distinction of being operable in the sense that it slides open. So, is that a borrowed light? Hard to say. I'm going to say that it is. Now, let's take a look at where they say mullions may be used to divide individual glazed area. Let's go back to borrowed light. Mullions may be used to divide individual glazed areas. Let's take a look. Here is a borrowed light that we did in 1993, maybe? This is, I'm sure that it's still installed. This is installed when it was a bank at North, Damon, and Milwaukee. It's like a 6 corners sort of intersection. 16 gauge door, 14 gauge frame. We made this in the shop. Individual borrowed lights. The client drew this. We didn't draw this. The client gave us what they wanted. They specified these narrow lights. They wanted narrow lights. But it was just fun because I remember very well, you know, the client, his name, his business, what they bought from us. And this was 30 years ago, in fact. So this is a great example of that. The door, all the stick material we had to order from the factory because the dimension up here, which may have been 6 inch, I don't really recall what that was. That might be 6. The sill may have been 4, or maybe it's all 6 inch. 2 inch here. All that had to be ordered because the client, and this picture was taken maybe 10 years after we didn't install it. 10 years after we supplied it to the client. The client specified all of it to be galvanized. Yeah, so I took the picture. It was sold in 93, installed in 2009, all galvanized. You don't see any surface rust anywhere. No rust down here. There's probably traces of it, but that galvanized really held up super well. So this is just an easy at arm length example. Now, what I would have suggested to the client if they ordered it today, I would never have suggested butt hinges, given this was a 3670 16 gauge galv. This should have been pivots or a continuous hinge is what it should have been. You can see the gap up here. You can see the lack of gap down here. That's evidence of hinge being a bad idea there. That was incorrect. I would have told the client it's too much. Even though it was just really a service door, the opening, the owner would have been better suited with a set of pivots and an intermediate. Okay, so let's dive into the weird world of the internet. Borrowed light, images, see if we can come up with anything interesting. Yeah, so school, very typical. That's a borrowed light. Nothing unusual about this. You can make these in your shop all day long. Here's a neat radiused face. That appears to be aluminum, though. Still a borrowed light. Just different base material. Western Central MFG. Yeah, great. These are windows This is clearly in an exterior application with anchor hinges. That's really cool. You don't see anchor hinges often nowadays, but the same sort of concept. Interior, borrowed light. This would be a side light frame, but nonetheless, those are borrowed lights. Side light frame. You know, I don't love the height of this 8-inch or 10-inch, whatever it is, but that doesn't matter to me. Obviously curved. Not impossible to make, just takes some math, that's to be sure. Lots of cuts. And there are guys in shops that can do that, make easy work of it, in fact. Glazing channel, as I had mentioned before. You've got to be careful that the projection, or I should say the height, is going to be appropriate for anything that's going to be UL listed. But in terms of your classic borrowed light, there it is. A rectangle, generally, square, whatever. You're going to have mullions. That's all there is to it. Yeah. I don't know who West Central Manufacturing is. West Central MFG. I've never heard of them, actually, which just simply doesn't matter. But they do have details here. So when it comes to these borrowed lights, lots of profile options. Anything that can be put into a press brake can be made. Let's wrap up this video on camera. If you are enjoying this video, please click thumbs up or like, and also please consider subscribing to our channel. Let's move on to the rest of the video. So that's your borrowed light. Generally, any gauge of steel, any type of steel that can be done on a door frame, you're certainly going to do in a borrowed light. You want to really be sure when you're ordering material, like for that job of the bank, the 14 gauge galv, which would be considered non-stock 14 gauge stick material. If I was going to stock stick material that wasn't 16 gauge cold rolled, it would be galvanized in 14 gauge. And I probably kept a little bit of it on hand at some point in the past, just for someone who says, yeah, I want it to be heavier. I need it to be whatever. You want to really think through what all of your cut sizes are going to be so that when you order the material, you're not short a few pieces, because it could be a long lead time, and of course, common carrier cartage. You don't want to be looking at a $500 invoice to get yourself the missing 6 feet that you have to have. And mixing and matching 16 and 14 gauge is really not a good idea at all. If you ever do anything that's 12 gauge, you know, you're going to find that you're not going to just mate up 16 gauge to it very well. 12 gauge is not unusual, and I should say it's not unheard of in an exterior application. But that's going to be an extremely heavy-duty application where you're going to need 12-gauge stick material. You'll know you're not cutting 16 gauge anymore. The next definition is bottom channel. Yeah, let's get into bottom channel. Thank you. Thank you for watching, and if you've enjoyed this video, please click thumbs up, please subscribe, and maybe even send the video to someone that you know. Thank you.